The Forbidden Woods, Bloodborne's deepest, darkest, and most divisive level. Its eerie tone and unrelenting sense of gloom make it undoubtedly a memorable physical space, but are its elements of design memorable for perhaps the wrong reasons? With a concept centered around disorienting visual themes and distractingly open layouts, this spooky forested region can be an incredibly immersive experience that makes you feel like you're vanishing into the very depths of Yharnam. But it can also be the cause of confusion, stress, and excessive wear and tear, and what follows is an often startlingly dense level that players can truly get lost in. Getting lost, however, can mean many different things and result in many different emotions, some of which you'll savor and some of which you'll simply endure. This is the level design of Bloodborne, The Forbidden Woods. In part 1 of this video, we looked at the first half of The Forbidden Woods and discussed how it accomplishes its goal of transitioning the player away from the established areas of Yharnam by taking them through the beginnings of a dark and disorienting journey before entering the heart of the level, the winding and tangled woods that are the region's namesake. If you haven't yet seen that video, it would make sense to start there. You can find the link in the description. Part 2 will be focused on the second half of the level, but ultimately we'll be viewing the design of this section from a much more philosophical perspective rather than a practical analysis, certainly more so than any of the other videos in this series so far. The village and its surrounding areas found in the first half of the Forbidden Woods feature design that's akin to a hybrid between the more structured streets, alleys, and corridors found in the beginning stages of Bloodborne and the more free-form open layout we'll soon see in the latter half of this level. Up to this point, we saw glimpses of the region's trademark features, like multiple paths of entry that can facilitate uncertainty, or more subdued landmarks that can inhibit efficient environmental mapping. But the design of the Forbidden Woods takes a pretty severe turn once we enter its actual wooded area. Gone are the more condensed, manageable segments found throughout the village, and in their place is a sprawling forest full of disorienting terrain and a complexly open layout, or at least a confusingly open layout. It's not a stretch to say that this section of the Forbidden Woods is home to the most challenging mental mapping in all of Bloodborne. The wide open layout, persistent darkness, and use of visual assets that blend together make it extremely difficult for the player to collect their bearings and remember the many paths they may have taken. Even the Nightmare Frontier, often chided for its mundanely monotonous environment, benefits from its use of a bright lighting scheme and long draw distances. With those advantages absent in the Forbidden Woods, there is next to nothing present to assist the average player trying to familiarize themselves with the area. The result of this is often a lot of confusion, wandering, backtracking, and sometimes frustration. In reality, the correct path through the woods is relatively linear in a sense, and is for the most part highlighted for the player by the torches that line it. But it's important to remember that, as with any good FromSoft level, there are points of interest scattered about the environment that invite the player to fully explore it. Maybe it's a short hop over an opening to an inconspicuous side path, or a glowing item in the distance, or an enemy lurking behind the brush that you want to take care of just to be safe. What could potentially be a fairly straightforward path ultimately turns into a meandering series of departures from the main goal. The difference in the Forbidden Woods compared to most other levels in Bloodborne is that here, once you veer off your initial path, it can be very difficult to confidently find your way back. Check out the central outdoor area in Cainhurst Castle as a counterexample. Upon entering this visually striking scene, we are presented with a wide open landscape with very clear paths on either side to reach the castle. But there's also a somewhat ominous central path that leads downward towards the underground. And while it's likely that most players will assume the dark halls of the castle itself is where they ultimately need to end up, it's also a safe bet that many will want to explore this open outdoor environment as well and choose to venture down. But if that is the choice, no matter how far you go, it's extremely easy to find your way back up, orient yourself, and navigate to either of the other paths despite the wide open nature of this section of the level. In the Forbidden Woods, this ease of navigation is nowhere to be found, as grassy pathways blend with tangling trees that morph with shapeless hillsides that fuse with shadowy rock faces. There always seems to be a switchback or forked pathway every step you take, turning each opportunity to explore into a potential risk that could cause the player to get lost amongst the many homogeneous components of the environment. All of those nebulous features are further blended together with the use of a dense fog that covers the entire region, obfuscating the player's view and sense of direction. We learn to accept that open sightlines are nothing but a pipe dream, and any chance of accurately locating landmarks is lost to the mysterious haze. With this type of deliberate muddling taking place, reliably navigating the woods goes from somewhat manageable to nearly impossible. And by the time the level literally begins to spiral into itself, the process of correctly mapping out its layout without some serious trial and error becomes extremely difficult. To be fair, FromSoft did warn us about this. Sort of. Think back to part 1 of this video when we focused on the layout of the level's village and how it's set up in a way that deliberately pulls the player away from the main area multiple times by inviting them to explore each open residence. That is the same design concept we now see in the woods, but here it unfolds on a much larger scale. Unlike many of the other levels in Bloodborne that offer frequently branching but well-defined corridors, both subsections of the Forbidden Woods instead utilize less linear, free-roaming spaces with no clear pathways. And the amorphous nature of this design helps to dictate not only how the player traverses the environment, but also how they feel when they do so. In the case of the Forbidden Woods, the feeling of being lost is just as important as the actual state of being lost. The consuming darkness on all sides, the confusing layout and architecture, the inability to see other parts of Yharnam in the distance. This is a location in which the player is meant to feel like they've gotten themselves into a situation they may never get out of. These choices form the foundation of some of the key questions surrounding this level's design. Because without a doubt, FromSoft successfully achieved their goal with this region of creating a disorienting, puzzlingly tedious space, and even more importantly, of eliciting in the player the sensation of feeling lost, without hope, and far away from any point of safety. In a game full of spaces that evoke the fear of being in a foreign environment, from a developer that specializes in creating these kind of scenarios, the Forbidden Woods perhaps takes this idea to its highest level, which naturally begs the question, is it too much? Is this level too good at achieving what it sets out to do? And ultimately, when is it unwise to sacrifice the experience of your player base for the sake of reaching a design goal? Of course, many variations of this question are asked of From Software every time they release a new title. Is this game too difficult? Does that game alienate a population of its audience by being as challenging as it is? Shouldn't you be less obscure in explaining vital gameplay mechanics? Should a game's story be locked behind item descriptions and environmental details? All of these components are, and have been, deliberate design decisions on the part of FromSoft. But just because something is deliberate, does that make it the right choice? If you're triggered at the very idea of FromSoft being capable of poor design choices, I'd invite you to look at this with a perspective of curiosity, because these questions are completely legitimate when your goal is to create a rational dialogue about game design. That's one of the reasons why the design of the Forbidden Woods, and in particular its second half, is so effective at facilitating this discussion. Because Bloodborne is a highly regarded title among both FromSoft fanatics and more casual gamers alike. And even with that in mind, this region of the game tends to be divisive at best. Of course, there are those who love it, and for many of those players, their enjoyment is often because of the design choices at the heart of this discussion. Embracing the likelihood of getting lost in this environment and allowing themselves to become absorbed by its darkness is part of the appeal for this camp. But many others find the Forbidden Woods to be tedious, or discouraging, or unpleasant, or some combination of those and many other less savory words. At the very least, even those who like or appreciate the level are still able to recognize why its design has the potential to make other players feel negatively about it. And that makes it an interesting piece of ammunition for this design debate, because most players likely agree with the reasons why the Forbidden Woods is able to stick so stubbornly to its design goal and emotional concept. But it's the reaction to that stubbornness that can create player experiences on seemingly opposite ends of the spectrum. Now, if you're on the side of, I never want to see this level again, one of the counter-arguments to consider is because the Forbidden Woods takes these ideas to such extremes, it also has the ability to result in greater payoffs compared to some of the other more straightforward areas of the game. And we can even pinpoint an example of this to one specific moment during our journey through the woods. A moment that brings us back to a very familiar place. And on the edge of this transitional area is the last safe space we'll encounter for a while, as we see the familiar glow of a lantern propped up in front of a surely abandoned windmill hut. This location was one of the single most impactful spaces in the entire game for me, because it's home to one of those signature FromSoft moments of relief that can only stem from many anxiety-inducing preceding moments that test your limits and challenge your ability to push through a seemingly hopeless experience. You see, in order to rediscover this area of the level, it requires you to tackle the long and arduous journey through the entire village, and then hope you guess correctly as far as which direction you're going to go once you enter the woods. And during that time, you're either going to die a lot, or you're going to manage to survive, which in many cases results in even more anxiety since the pressure continues to mount as you venture deeper and deeper into unknown territory, desperately hoping to stumble upon a safe haven. And this is true, to varying degrees, in all areas of Bloodborne. But the Forbidden Woods has the ability to elevate these feelings even further, and that ability is due directly to the same features the level is criticized for: its long, dark, sometimes convoluted layout that intentionally disorients the player. I've said before that one of Bloodborne's flaws in my eyes is that because it has such tightly polished level design layouts, it actually starts to become predictable in certain areas, and this is most obvious when it comes to the placement of shortcuts. With some general knowledge of the way the game's levels are set up, and a decent sense for direction and distance, it's not too difficult to make some really solid educated guesses as to when a shortcut or route back to a safe area is going to appear. For the most part, Bloodborne really does follow a pretty rigid template as far as this goes, and structurally, this template is still followed in the Forbidden Woods. But because the navigation of its environment can be so cloudy, it's often hard to tell where you even are, let alone predict what might be coming up. And that means when you do discover one of these coveted shortcuts, it's actually a surprise, and certainly a welcome one at that. The general pathing through the Forbidden Woods turns out to be nearly identical to that of a previous level we examined in this series, Hemwick Charnel Lane. That is, it consists of two largely circular loops, with the initial smaller loop set inside the larger one. But unlike Hemwick Charnel Lane, which operates at only a fraction of the scale of some of Bloodborne's larger levels, the Forbidden Woods offers much more ground to cover, and some connections and layouts that are not nearly as easily mappable. So the result ends up being a variation of this tried and true level layout, which is then enhanced, at least in this sense, by its larger scale and disorienting visual design. To follow that up, the level's second shortcut is even more unexpected, and in fact, because of its placement on an out-of-the-way side path, it's possible that many players may not have ever even found it on their first time through the area. No joke, when I came back here to record footage of this shortcut, I was sure I knew exactly how to get to it, and of course I ended up getting turned around and circled half the level before actually finding it. Turns out hubris is your greatest enemy in the entangled landscapes of the Forbidden Woods. But again, that degree of unexpectedness is created only by pushing the player through a level that is confusing, twisting, and yes, sometimes frustrating. So for some players, all of these design components on the surface can fly a little too close to a negative experience, and I wouldn't argue against anyone who's stuck to that take. In fact, at times, I might even be one of them. But through its challenges emerges that special component of classic FromSoft level design that ultimately becomes incredibly rewarding, and is implemented here in the Forbidden Woods to the highest degree. On a first playthrough, with all of these elements in place to make the player feel lost and uncomfortable, the woods can be an incredibly taxing region to complete. But if you're able to really take your time to explore the area, not out of caution, but out of curiosity, this is one of the most densely packed open levels you'll find, and you're rewarded for that exploration. There's loot and items to be found everywhere, seemingly around every corner, hidden behind every set of gravestones. It's a complex area of a complex region that's full of places to discover and secrets to find. With the first half of the level slowly introducing its more open concepts and intentionally confusing visual design, and the second half kicking these concepts into ultra-high gear, perhaps no other region in the game presents the same type of divisive dichotomy as the Forbidden Woods does. Its two main sections offer two sides of the same coin, but end up landing on nearly opposite ends of the level design experience. The first half, the village area and its surroundings, leverages disorientation to create an environment that ends up being cloudy but manageable. It both changes the pace and breaks the mold of previous areas while still managing to maintain the tight and deliberate level design that Bloodborne is known for. The second half, the spiraling, indiscernible forest, pushes the boundaries of this philosophy, providing confusion but little clarity. It offers a polarizing experience that can't help but provoke questions about developer intention versus player enjoyment. Yet despite this, both sections are held together by their underlying theme of creating a perplexing space that takes time and effort to map out and master. For some, this can result in a rewarding experience that slowly paints a clearer picture over time, sometimes only after multiple playthroughs. For others, it may cause feelings of frustration, confusion, and stress. FromSoft clearly had a vision for what they wanted to accomplish with this section of the game, and I think it's undeniable that they achieved what they set out to do. But was that vision actually what was best for players and their experience throughout this point in the game? And if it wasn't, how much does that actually matter to each player? FromSoft game design is constantly in this very state of testing balance, deliberately tiptoeing the edges to see what they can get away with in order to provide a memorable payoff. And ultimately, it's up to each individual player to decide if these careful footsteps topple too far in one direction or the other. This is one of the reasons why games like Bloodborne can be so divisive amongst different types of players. One camp will vehemently defend every decision the studio makes, especially when those decisions result in genuinely satisfying moments or experiences. The other side will quite easily poke holes in and pick apart the steps that are taken to get to that end result. Of course, most rational people are probably somewhere between the two. And Bloodborne's Forbidden Woods is a fantastic example of this battle playing out. Because in this case, no one else's answer is correct except for your own. What's more important to you? The means or the end? The experience or the concept? The level's place in your playthrough or its place in the world of Yharnam? Your answers to these questions and the weight you place on each of them are ultimately what are going to determine your thoughts on the design of the Forbidden Woods. Because no matter what side you're on, this level is FromSoft game design in its most limit-pushing, most stress-tested form. And the subsequent moments when you finally stumble upon one of Bloodborne's most significant landmarks wouldn't be quite the same without the confusing, mystifying, and very forbidden path that lies before it. Hey, thanks for watching. This video concludes the two-part series on the level design of the Forbidden Woods, but with your help, there could be many more of these design breakdowns in the future. So do me a favor and like this video, subscribe if you're really into this stuff, and leave a comment letting me know which area or level in any FromSoft game is the one you least look forward to venturing into. You can also check out my Patreon where I post both free and exclusive content for followers. See you next time.